Welcome everyone to our 17th webinar now. I'm Mike Benson and I look after Wales and the west of England, and we're joined by Mr. Carl Heron, our master brewer.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm very well, very well. So we're going to go through our cost-saving tips in the brewery. I don't think we're going to go over uncharted ground anywhere today. There's not anything that's going to be anything that that's new to most people. But as we're going along, we're going to be having a good chat. So do ask questions in the Q&A, and we'll try and pick them up as we're going along. Otherwise, over to you, Carl.
Indeed, thanks, Mike. Yeah, there's only 6 slides with information on it, so you might want to keep a pad handy just to jot stuff down if it's things you've not come across before. And we're going to be sort of around afterwards if you want to just have a chat, say that you've got some other ideas, or maybe that you use you're doing some of the things that we've talked about. So we'd appreciate that. So lots of questions, please, and let's really get into this and have a good discussion. Okay, so let's start going through the slides now. Do you want to go? Here we go. So what I'll talk about first is the philosophy around cost savings. Mike and I have worked in the industry for quite some time now. I've been involved heavily I've certainly been involved heavily in cost savings in the past with different jobs I've had. So I'm trying to share some of that. Some ideas might seem a bit radical, and these are all up to you what choices you say. But I think one of the first things is starting with a good baseline. So understanding where you're at. So a couple of places that I've worked at, that wasn't there when I first arrived. And so I really sort of got into the nuts and bolts of what materials were being used, what times and temperatures were being used, and so on, and started to really understand those. So raw materials in terms of your grist, your hops, chemicals, water, all that kind of stuff. Energy, of course, you need to measure that. So go and have a look at your meter readings and start to get an understanding of what it costs per brew, especially if you've got one of these smart meters. These are really clever things. Like I said, consumables, that can be caustic, or it can be peracetic acid, cleaning materials, but it could be cardboard boxes, bottles, keg caps, shives, keystones, all that kind of thing. That all adds up. And to have those in some kind of Excel spreadsheet, and I've got one of these, by the way, if ever you want to have a look at it, like a blank one, you could make your own. And understanding those things actually gets you to a kind of cost per barrel, what it's actually costing you to make that beer. So when you've got a new beer to make, you can actually plug that into your spreadsheet, and you can actually understand what it's costing you, and then come to some kind of price point, building your margin and that kind of thing. So it's good to adapt recipes or look at changes in raw material costs from one year to another and understand the impact of that, so you pass that on and you're still making the profits and the margins that you need to keep your brewery going. The key thing, once you've got that, is starting to measure things. So a good brew sheet will actually prompt the brewer to look at all the right things. And I'm talking about things like temperatures, like the time that you mash in, the time it takes you to mash, the time it takes you to boil, transfer times, how long are your pumps running. Pumps are expensive things. How long does it take you to chill a beer down? Because you're using glycol coolants, using pumps to pump that glycol, etc., etc. There's lots and lots of things. So the more you can write down and capture per brew, the better it is. And all that information is also quite good. If you get a beer that's gone a little bit off track, then you can look at why that might have happened, because you've got all that data behind it to see what were different to the brewers that were okay, let's say. So always measure and record as much as you can, and that's a very good reference point. When you do start to change things, and maybe pick up some suggestions, some of the suggestions in the presentation, do them one at a time, because that will give you a good indication of how successful that particular change has been, and you can evaluate the impact from a cost perspective, but also from a beer quality perspective. So that's quite important. One thing I would warn against, and I've been asked to do this in previous roles, is go for cheaper raw materials or increase the amount of adjuncts or processed materials that you put into your beers. And it's always tempting to kind of go for that because things are tight, and we all know why that is. But without doing that and fully understanding the impact, it's a big thing to jump into. So full process testing to make sure it doesn't impact on process times, and absolutely on product testing, doing flavor matching and making sure that there's no major shifts could save a lot of time and heartache, because what you don't want to do is lose your faithful customers who enjoy your beer. And by doing some of these things, you can actually go down that road and find yourself lacking. So that's a little bit about the philosophy. So let's get into the meat of this. Let's talk about malt to begin with. Fundamentally, not just saying this because I work for Crisp now, buying good quality malt that's well modified will save money, without doubt. It's really important because well modified malt gives up its extract much more easily, and that means that you're going to get a better yield at the end of the day. So if you go for a cheaper one, make sure if you are going to do that, that you really understand what it's about and make sure that it's as good, if not better. And hopefully that will give you the right indications to make the decision properly. Last run-ins. This is something a lot of people don't really check, but you can fine-tune last run-ins by adjusting the amount of mash liquor and sparge liquor that you use. As a rule of thumb, to get the best you can and get maximum yield out of your malt, running down to 1.5 to 2 bricks on your refractometer, you know, the little telescope thing, or using a hydrometer just to check you get down to maybe 106 or 108, will be about the optimum to get the maximum extract. Don't be tempted to go any lower than that, because you could start pulling through some astringent, harsh flavors that aren't good for the beer. It could impact on head retention as well.
Carl, with that, bricks is pretty much the same as Plato.
It is indeed.
SG is basically because we're too busy to worry about a decimal place.
Yes.
The same as what normal brewer's gravity is.
Indeed.
Just get rid of the decimal. Got other things to worry about.
Yeah, so, I mean, like Mike says, there are international units for that international audience. So yeah, absolutely. Bricks is pretty much what Plato is, so you can work on that. Okay, another idea, and quite a lot of brewers in the UK use this, particularly in the north, for head retention, is wheat. So wheat generally is it's a cheaper form of extract. It does cost less. In terms of extract per kilo, it's about the same, cost less. You get head retention benefits, but you also get a cheaper extract at the end of the day. So I did a quick sum, and I reckon that a 10% inclusion of malted or torrefied wheat would give you about a 20 pence a bottle saving. So it doesn't sound like much, but it all adds up at the end of the day.
Is there a preference over torrefied and malted there, Carl?
Torrefied will generally give you a slightly better head retention, according to the stuff I've read up about it, because you've not malted away, if you like, or modified away some of the large molecular weight proteins that help form the head. So that can be a benefit. But if you're all concerned about extract and about conversion, then use malted wheat. A malted wheat's probably got a little bit more flavour than torrefied.
Yeah,
so it will bring a kind of at 10% probably not, but above that maybe a slightly searing amount.
Okay.
Something to think about. Not sure how many people out there are using Haze stabilizers either in their brewery or they're paying a contract packer to use it, and they send their beer away for packaging. But generally, if you're filtering something to put into a can, bottle, or a keg, indeed, you would use a Haze stabilizer. So the two things that form haze are haze-sensitive proteins and polyphenols. When those two things start to complex together over time, they become visible, and that's what throws the haze. So the two things you use to get rid of those are either a silica hydrogel for the haze-sensitive proteins, or for the polyphenols, use something called PVPP, which only a couple of people in the world manufacture, and it's really expensive. Now, we developed a malt many years ago now called Clear Choice, and Clear Choice was bred so that it didn't have these polyphenol precursors in it. So basically, the sweet wort, before you put any hops in there, will have 0 polyphenols in it. So even when you've added your hops on, and there's plant material in the hops, you're going to get some polyphenols from that. It wouldn't be high enough to affect haze after filtration or through a colloidal haze during shelf life. So by using Clear Choice, you can ask your contract packer not to put Clear Choice PVPP in there, and that should reduce the cost of the service. Or indeed, if you're using them yourself, then you don't need to put that in because the Clear Choice doesn't have any polyphenol precursors. So just to clarify that, haze, in the haze sensitive part of the polyphenols, 80% of it comes from malt generally. And most malts, all other malts in fact, apart from Clear Choice, do have that 80% polyphenol level in there, whereas Clear Choice does. So any questions on that, let me know. I did a quick sum on that as well, and I reckon Clear Choice is a bit more expensive to buy than regular malt, but overall I think the net savings about 50 quid a ton. Yeah. So converting it back to malt, but we can show you that calculation, and it is a really nice malt to brew with as well. So.
It is. Interestingly as well on that, Carl, we're running some trials at the minute to back up some of the claims we make, and we're also seeing that the sensitive proteins are a lot less as well using it, which was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
So it is quite literally doesn't need any stabilization and works at warmer temperatures as well, so you can save some money on cooling.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, that's something that we can also kind of look at as well, because we know from the experiments that Mike's conducting that is actually the case, that you can basically condition at 4 degrees and still have the same degree of colloidal stability in the beer. Another one to keep an eye on and have a look at is the COA. So for each of the malts that you buy, you should get a certificate of analysis. And the way we make malt, there is always a tolerance, and colours and extracts can move up and down within that tolerance band. So you can actually, by batch, adjust the amount of these malts that you put in to get the same result at the end. So you might find that you've got a particularly good extract, and that means that you can put less malt in to get the same yield. It might be that you've got a crystal 150 that's at the top end of spec at 160, so you can put a little bit less crystal 150 in, still get the same colour. So it's just a matter of paying attention to that. And if you've got this wonderful spreadsheet that I was talking about, it will actually do them calculations for you. You just put the different parameters in every time you get a new batch, and that will actually tell you how to adjust up or down, as the case may be. Mike, can you keep an eye on questions?
Yeah, we've got 2 coming in. So the first one is from Alex, and says, is there an ideal liquor to grist ratio for malt extract, or is it brew house specific?
To be honest, I couldn't answer because I've never used brewer's extract. So if we're talking about malt, it really depends on the style of beer that you're brewing. My go-to is 2.5 to 1 liquor to grist. So is that what you're asking there, Alex?
Yeah, it's liquor to grist for ratio, so best for extract.
2.5 to 1, I would say.
Yeah.
And then just making sure that you're mashing with that, taking account of your foundation liquor, and then using, like, fine-tuning your sparge so that you get the volume in your kettle, but you also make sure that you've got those last runnings down to 6 to 8 SG.
Yeah.
And that's how you can calculate that.
There was another one that came in. I can't see it. Kevin's we got one in. Someone said, is it easy to work out the difference between litre degree and percent extract between the malts? There is a calculation. I must say I don't know, and I was speaking to our technical director about this yesterday.
Yeah, there is a formula, yeah, and I've got it somewhere in my notes, so we'll make that available on the website, and we'll come back to everyone and let them know that. But yeah, there is a way of converting those, for sure.
Okay, and Kevin says, regarding haze stabilization, how much impact does a really vigorous boil have as opposed to using a stabilizer?
Good question. A good vigorous boil will actually precipitate some of the proteins out. So that will help with stabilization, but there'll still be some haze sensitive proteins there, I would suggest, that could complex with the polyphenols over time.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that, Mike, in your experience?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Extract extracts batch to batch. You could justify the malt bill based on extracts, but you can live with different batch sizes. Then, is there any needs? Sorry, well, I don't quite understand that one. With the batch extra, how popular amongst brewers, to brew unfiltered beer? Is it trending more than
Indeed.
unfiltered?
That's a good point. You know, at the end of the day, I think filtration and clarity aren't as important as they were. So from that perspective, it's not as important. In fact, if you're looking for something that's got a haze and you want to keep that haze, then thinking about, like, for example, not using copper finings and not using auxiliary finings will actually help that haze hold up in the glass and stay there across shelf life. So that's a slightly different angle. And yeah, in terms of what we're talking about, clear choice is more suited, I would suggest, to sort of getting that clarity if you're doing bright beer.
Yeah, I understand what Will's asked now. So if you're getting different collection volumes batch to batch, is there any need to adjust for extracts?
Indeed, probably not for extract, to be fair. But I would suggest from the kind of specialty malt perspective, there is some opportunity there. Specialty malts are obviously quite a bit more expensive, albeit you don't have as many of them. But by adjusting up and down, depending on where they are on that specification for colour, for example, that will give you consistent colour in your beers and potentially can save you some money. But it's good. It's good practice anyway to do that. But yes, fair point. At the end of the day, if you end up with a bit more, great. End up with a bit less, yeah, that's just less yield, but it's where it is.
My thoughts on that are you're concentrating or diluting hops and colour. So if you know that you don't know what you're going to get from each batch that's coming through, and you put the same amount of materials in for it, then you run the risk of if you've got more volume than what you're expecting, then you've diluted your bitterness and your flavour and your colour. And if you've collected less, you've concentrated it. So that would be my take on that. For me, I want to be collecting the same amount, if I was honest with you.
Yeah, sort of batch to batch variation.
One more comment. With unfiltered packaged beer, what is the impact of the flavour of the haze, and and how much is shelf life reduced? That we've opened a can of worms here on.
Yeah, I mean, I think flavour-wise, there's not a big impact. To be honest, it's a colloidal haze, so I wouldn't imagine it has a major effect on flavour. To be honest, not something I've experimented with, but from my experience, I don't think it have a major impact. And from a shelf life perspective, it's not kind of in terms of taste, it's more about how it looks. So if it's hazy anyway, then that doesn't have a major impact. It's not going to get any worse. But you've got to be careful that it stays the same. And there's a whole kind of science there that's still being investigated about how stable a haze is once it's in a keg or in a can. Does it drop out? If it does, why? There's loads and loads of work going on about that in a minute. And it's still yet to be fully understood, I think.
Yeah, cool.
Okay.
Right, we'll come back to some of the other questions there. We've got a couple more coming in, but I think we're going to touch on them in a bit.
Yeah.
Anyway. Okay. Now, malt costs. Done.
Yeah.
That.
Yep, get rid. The elephant's out of the room, Mike. I like it. Good one. Okay, so let's talk about hops. One thing that should be available from your hop merchant is something called a Type 45 pellet. So if you are using pellets, then T90s are the standard. T45s have got less of the kind of vegetable plant material in there and more of the like lupulin gland material. So that means you've got, let's say, a higher concentration of alpha acids, beta acids, and aroma compounds. So if you're using T90s for aroma, sort of like the last hopping, like flame out or indeed dry hopping, then using T45s, and I think they've got some fancy names for them now, does definitely give you the same impact for less material going in. So Mike, you've had some experience with this, yeah?
Yeah, I never actually used them, but I should have done, because the cost saving bit comes in. The hops are going to be about the same price for utilization to type 90, but because you're going to be putting less in, you're putting less material in that ultimately you've got to get rid of. So whether that's into the boil, you're going to create less trub, and if you're going to create less trub, then you're going to get more wort out the kettle, use less effluents, you know. And if it's going to go in at dry hop, then you're going to again put less solids in and be able to lose less beer basically in wastage through trub and bottoms.
Yeah.
So I wish that I'd used them. We had the opportunity a few years ago, probably 8 years ago.
Been around for a long time.
Available then were mainly around the German varieties, if I remember rightly. We weren't using them, but lately they seem to be coming back with a bang for the big American hops as well.
I think they might be called different names, so have a look, speak to your hop merchant, but that will definitely help, because I suppose, like you say, Mike, in terms of cost, it might not be that different for the aroma that you're going to get, but the fact you're putting less in there means you're going to get much less of that lovely green stuff out the bottom.
Yeah.
Which means you've got more beer to package. And at the end of the day, that's where the money is. So.
Luke's, while we're on this bit, Luke's just asked, are T45 and cryo hops the same?
Not sure.
Don't think
to be honest.
I'm pretty certain they're not, if I'm honest with you.
Yeah, I think cryo hop is even more concentrated. I think.
Yes.
I wouldn't like to.
I did used to know exactly what the difference was, but I can't remember. Alexandro says, hi, are cryo hops made more cost savings than T45 pellets? I think that one's up for it's along the same route, if I'm honest with you. Because,
similar kind of thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's exactly the same point of view as between 45 and T90s, because it's all about putting less in with more concentrated stuff. Cryo hops were expensive. I don't know what's going on with them now, and I don't know in comparison to T45. But
again, probably a good question for your hop merchant, and then just sitting down and doing the calculations. But like we said earlier, with any of these changes, just validate it on a small scale if you can, but otherwise one brew at a time, compare it to the last one, just to make sure that there's not been any changes, because there's obviously lots of different materials in there.
Yeah, used a lot of cryo in my last job, and I think the claim was you could probably use half as much. We didn't get that. It was like half as much for like 20% more, something like that. So there should have been a cost saving. In reality, we didn't see it as a cost saving, but we liked the way that they tasted and smelled.
Okay, let's talk about a few others. So, as you will all probably well know, when you put hops into a brew, they've got alpha acids in them, and as you boil them, they change shape, they isomerize, and they become bitter. And that shape just happens to fit on the bitterness receptors on our tongue. So that's why it's important to boil hops. If you're wanting bitterness, if you've got a bitterness target, then I would suggest you use high alpha hops at the beginning of the boil to get that. Yeah, because that's the most cost-effective way of getting bitterness. Layering that up with the other hops, either for flavor or aroma, can come afterwards, 20 minutes, half an hour into the boil, flame out, or indeed dry hop. For bitterness, high alpha hops, beginning of boil, just makes more sense in terms of getting your bang for your buck and getting the flavor that you're looking for and the bitterness that you're looking for. There are often situations where you fall in love with a hop and you get it in your beer and it does incredibly well, and then it starts to get difficult to get hold of, and the price starts to rocket and you think, oh, this is going to cost me a fortune. I can't let go changing the cost of my beer to the people who are buying it. I've been there with that, and there are some pretty good sources of information on the internet now about what you can substitute for what. So I would suggest, if you're going to consider that, if you're in a bit of a corner in terms of what you can buy because it's just not available, or it's got a lot more expensive because it's in short supply, then get some samples from your merchant. Just a 10, 20 grams would do, and just make some hop teas. So, Mike, how do you go about making a hop tea?
It's very similar to how we do the malt teas, if I'm honest with you. Most of it's in the rub, I think, with the hops.
Yeah.
Malt tea with the hop tea. We didn't normally use it for too much for flavor assessment, because you kind of got some. You can also get some stewed flavors coming through.
Yeah, some vegetables.
Water. So there's a bit.
Just doing the rubs the best thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It's really good practice to have a second point of call for hops, because they are obviously open to growing seasons. So.
Yeah, and that's the thing. At the end of the day, it's always good to know what you can substitute in, and they are quite well detailed, these, and they have been studied. I've got one I had from a previous job, but it's probably 7 or 8 years old now, so I'm more than happy to share that, but it needs to be validated. And there are much more up-to-date information, but I know that one was thoroughly investigated, by the company I worked for. So, okay.
There was a hop substitution book knocking about that's actually quite good as well. So it'll tell you all of the attributes to the hops, and then all of the different potential substitutes, even down to blending different hops together to get there.
As long as all the essential oils are there that you're looking for, and you're going to get the same compounds, then it's not too bad. So, okay, Mike, this one of your ones. So
yes, it's basically going back to one of the questions that we've already had as well. So if you know that you're getting inconsistent volumes coming through your brew house, even if you don't know that, even if you've got consistent volumes coming through, we also take yeast off. So my point along this one is that just dry hop for the known volume within the tank, or what you think's in there. Because if we're dry hopping at a rate of what we're up to these days, like 10, 20 grams per litre is pretty normal. A few 100 litres can make quite a big difference to your hop costs. Some of these hops at £30 a kilo, and if you're constantly doing it, then as well as giving you the savings of the hops, you're also going to get inconsistencies through your brews, because you're going to be putting different amounts in basically for a brew quantity. So that's my point around that one.
I suppose the difficulty is, and we kind of covered it a little bit later, is just in a craft brewery, it's not always that easy to know how much you've got in there. So we talk later about buying a flow meter, so you can actually count how much is moved from one vessel to another, or how much you've got out of this or that, and it's really good for like monitoring your liquid losses, but also it's great for this kind of stuff. And like when you do bottom a tank and you're taking the yeast off, then you can measure that into buckets, and you can count that and deduct that off what you had before. Or a relatively easy way, if you've got fairly straightforward vessels, is you can dip it. So the calculations for working out the volume of a cylinder with a cone on it aren't that difficult. And so once you've done that for one vessel, you've done it for them all, and you can dip it from the site, from the hatch at the top, and know from that how much beer you've actually got to dry hop, and then working that out will, like Mike says, save you quite a bit of money. So. Okay. Another one, Mike?
Yeah, so we came across this when we did the West Coast and the East Coast IPA webinars, and the research we're doing about hops. We don't normally spend too much time talking about hops because we're the malt men, but if you add your hops in smaller batches and circulate, you actually get better extraction. So if you've got quite a high hop dosing, then you may be able to get away with splitting that into 2 or 3 additions and putting a little bit of agitation in there, not too much for a short time. and you might actually be able to improve the extract from the hops to give you much more flavour in the beer, which may be a win-win. Or if it then goes too much, then you can start saving on your hop.
Put a bit less in.
So yeah, there's quite a lot of literature out there on that. So it's a good thing to have further research in.
This kind of a bit similar to what we talked about with malt, really. Batch to batch, hops can have different alpha acid contents, and so if you're adding the hops for bitterness, then you can move those up or down according to the alpha acid content. And if you don't know it at the moment, you should know what utilization you get off your kettle, because every kettle's different. So you should know what that is by calculating how much iso-alpha acid you put in, as the bittering hop, and then getting someone to measure the beer, either measure the wort after boiling or measure the beer once it's in final pack. And you can calculate the end-to-end utilization, or you can calculate the kettle utilization. So that's what we're talking about. The utilization is the figure, how much of that alpha acid you isomerize. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about utilization. And you can move that up and down according to alpha acid content, which again means that you get consistent beer, potentially some cost savings. Last one on this slide. If you're using whole hops in your kettle, then you will probably leave quite a lot of work behind in those hops, because they obviously absorb moisture, and that doesn't end up in the fermenter, which means you're not going to get it into a cask or a keg, bottle or can. So one practice that I've heard of, and it's not too difficult to do, is you aim to brew slightly less volume with a slightly higher gravity. We're only talking about 2 or 3 points of gravity. And then you rinse the hops from the top of the vessel, preferably through a spray ball, and you just rinse the hops with hot liquor from the hot liquor tank. And you push that liquid through the system. So you've basically stripped off the sugar that's hanging on to the hops. You then push that through the system. So you've emptied all the pipes, you've emptied your heat exchanger, and you get all the extract in your fermentation vessel, which maximizes your yield. So that's a really good thing to do. You can only really do it with whole hops because they obviously form a bit of a filter bed. Trying to do it with type 90 pellets or pellets might be a bit more challenging, because you might strip some of those and end up taking some hop material or chug through into the fermenter, which might not be good. But certainly one way of doing it with whole hops. So ask any questions about that at the end if you want me to talk you through it.
Okay, we've got a few questions now. So Nigel should have brought some firearms guys on to give us a hand with some of the hot questions, actually.
Indeed.
Nigel says, do you see a swing back to malt forward beers as a result of brewers struggling economically?
Possibly, yeah, because at the end of the day, it does cost quite a bit. And I think maybe there's a change in people's tastes as well, in consumer taste. Certainly some research that I saw when I was doing product and process development suggested that there was an expectation and demand for lower bitterness in beers, and that were mainstream beers, to be fair. Craft beers are different, but I think the whole kind of really big IPA movement, particularly the West Coast stuff, which was massively bitter, it's great, tastes good, amazing aroma, but it's that kind of drinkability element. So I would suggest, to answer the question, yeah, I think there's a swing back towards malt forward beers, and it may be to do with economy, but I think also there's a drive there about making beers a bit more balanced and drinkable, which means you improve your sales, and that means that you make more beer and more money.
Yeah, I think we've moved through a phase. You see a lot of brewers now trying to get good lagers out as well, just because I think that the market's shifting a little bit.
Yeah.
So it'd be nice to see some different styles come on board now. And
for sure. And keep in mind as well that you can bring kind of different perceptions of bitterness. Adding more sulfate in your liquor can actually increase the perception of bitterness.
Yes.
Using roasted malts in darker beers brings an astringency, particularly if you use black or you use roasted barley. That'll give a tang. I was asked to match Guinness for a brewery that I worked at. Spent ages and ages throwing loads and loads of hops at this beer, and it just won't coming out. Just wasn't hitting the mark at all. Got to like 45 IBU or something like that, and I thought, this isn't working. And I happened to know some people at Guinness who had spent some time on a malting course in actual fact. And they shared with me how much roasted barley they used in a brew. And I implemented that, and bingo, there it was. A beer that tasted very much like Guinness and had that lovely kind of bite to it, which made you want to go for another one. So there's lots of different ways of getting that balance. But yeah, balance is maybe what it's all about. It depends what sort of beer you brew.
I prefer Murphy's, but we'll not go down that route. Kevin says, when purchasing your hops, you buy based on alpha acid per kilogram. Make sure you know the alpha acid range. If you're contracting out your hops, aware of hop merchants selling you by the kilogram. That's a good point, if I'm honest with you. Yes, you can save a lot of money if you buy your hops based on kilogram alpha acid kilogram.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, often, with craft brewers, it is just sold per kilo. But if there's a big variation in alpha from one season to next, you're getting stung. Because you're going to have to put a hell of a lot more in to get the same bitterness level, which means that you're losing out. So yeah, that conversation, I would certainly be having that if I were craft brewing now.
And I think as well, a lot of people now are looking at other acids and oils within hops as well, just to make sure they're getting the concentration consistency they're after.
Yeah, that's important.
So Alex asked, how popular is brewing double strength and then dilutes to half strength post brew to gain double the amount in fermenters? This would be saving his space, energy input.
Indeed. I think from a craft perspective, there aren't that many. And to be honest, in my experience, having tasted beers and managed beers, looked after beers that are double strength, there is a kind of penalty to pay in the fact that you have to dilute back that much that you start to lose body and flavour. So whilst I think high grav brewing does give you more esters, so you're not losing that proportion, but you do lose other flavours. So I'd probably go maybe a third more maximum. One brewery I worked at, I were casting at probably 50, 55 gravity and then diluting back to 40. And that worked out perfectly. And that helps your capacity, certainly. But it's only really helping your brewing capacity, that fermentation capacity. Me, as a brewer, I'll be honest, I would always sales gravity ferment, personally.
Yeah.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I've spent a lot of time doing high gravity brewing. Again, generally it was probably from 1060 down to 1038, 1040. That seems to be a good compromise between trying to get full utilization out of the brewery, because let's be honest, you can double the size of your brewery easily without spending a penny, apart from buying an RO machine to dilute back later on in a DO2 plant, which in the grand scheme of things is dirt cheap compared to new vessels and stuff. But there is the quality. It does affect it. It's not the same. Carl mentions esters. You got a lot more ester production and aldehyde production and all these other things as well, and they don't dilute 50-50. So if you got a certain amount of esters, say for a number you've got 70 esters produced from a high gravity brew, and you dilute it by 50%, you don't get 30, you don't get 35, you'll get more 50 to 60. They're just numbers of anything, but they don't dilute 50-50. So I think it's a good way to bring extra capacity to the brewery without a shadow of a doubt, but you've got to be careful with it. I'm not completely against it, if I'm honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, like I say, from a brew house perspective, when you kind of get into that point where you've maximised your brew house capacity, I don't think there's any harm if your tun's big enough to get that bigger gravity. But in terms of fermentation, yeah, just approach it with caution. Maybe not try and do too much, but if you are diluting, make sure you use deaerated liquor, obviously, because otherwise you're going to get all sorts of issues in terms of oxidized flavours and that kind of thing. So,
yeah. it's not a. I mean, people party guiled as well. Party guiling's not unheard of these days, and that's not is it a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know, but you can make one brew stream do a couple of different vessels. If you were clever, you could brew a 1060 gravity beer and dilute one to 1050, one to 1040. You know, add a few different things. You've got two different beers for one brew. That's for me. Kevin says as well, I high gravity brewing. If you look at double the strength, look at producing a whole new beer rather than diluting back to sale strength.
Yes.
I don't disagree with that. And does anyone know why the oil extraction improves if you add the hops in proportions? I can't remember from the top of my head, if I'm honest with you. I know there was trials going on. I think it's Stan Hieronymus has got some quite good stuff out there why this is. So he's got a couple of decent blogs and stuff to go and have a look at. And I think he's got a book out as well. So I'll point you in that direction there.
Really?
Anything else on that, Carl?
No.
No. Okay. You're away.
Right. Okay. So talk about yeast. Yeast, particularly dried yeast, is expensive, and indeed, if you are buying cultures, wet cultures, they can be quite pricey too. So I just want to talk a little bit about that. So a few people I've visited in this role have got 10-barrel breweries, and what they discovered was that if they used 250 grams rather than 500 grams of yeast for a sub 4.5% brew, they could actually get the same fermentation performance, same flavors, save 50% on yeast costs. And let's face it, dried yeast isn't cheap. So the caution there would be, obviously, once you've put your half back in, make sure the other half is properly sealed and goes into a clean fridge where it's not going to deteriorate, and don't leave that for too long. But there is definitely an opportunity there to save some money. And also, having spoken to some of the yeast manufacturers, they've done tests and they've shown that you can actually pitch in a dried yeast and then collect the yeast from that after fermentation and reuse it up to 5 times. So, Mike, do you want to talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, it was something that we always said that packet yeast you can't recrop, but it's been found that you can, and now 5 times is pretty much what all the yeast manufacturers are saying. Now, in the bigger brewery, you have specific tanks in there that are glycol cooled, with nice low shear mixing on them, and fully sterile vessels, and some quite nice PLC work to make sure everything goes in sync. But it can be done with buckets, quite simply, providing you're on top of your hygiene. Then get rid of that first bit that comes off the tank, and you go on. If you're on CCVs as well, skimming off the top is probably not recommended. But if you're on conicals, then get rid of that first bit of yeast shrub that comes off, because that's full of dead yeast and cold break. You don't particularly want in there. If you use that and you carry it over to the next fermenter, then you're probably going to get some uncontrollable fermentations. So get rid of that, collect the rest, weigh it, probably fill a bucket half full, and keep it in a big fridge at 4 degrees for 2-3 days. And you're away. A microscope or a centrifuge will let you. A microscope will let you do a cell count. A benchtop centrifuge will let you do a solids count, and you can do a pitch rate based on both of those, and save yourself a small fortune.
I think it's a good one, isn't it, Mike? Yeah.
If you are a little bit worried about some of the sterility as well, you can acid wash. Lower the pH of the yeast to 2.1 for between 2 to 4 hours, and it'll be good to go. You'll get rid of any lactic or bacteria infection in there, but you obviously won't get rid of any yeasts that you may have picked up. So it'll still let you wild yeast through. But yeah.
I mean, like as Mike says, it really is about hygiene. I mean, one place I worked at, quite a big brewery, doing 100, at that point, probably 120,000 hectolitres a year. using buckets that were cleaned with a soft sponge, nothing kind of scratchy. Yeah, they were cleaned in caustic. They were then rinsed with PAA, left the PAA in there, ready for cropping. When they were cropping, the guys used to put a clean coat on, like a lab coat. Yeah, so that there was nothing there that could sort of affect hygiene before they went anywhere near anything. Spray it, make sure it was all nice and sterile, all the fittings, the outlets. Blank caps were used everywhere, so nothing untoward could get in there. And then, like Mike says, you take off the first bit. It's usually it's a darker colour. You can see the particles in it. Once it starts looking nice and creamy, then you're ready to crop. And then it's just about taking that off into really clean buckets, as hygienically as possible, and then storing that at an appropriate temperature. And then the best way is definitely to do a cell count, viability, and the solids content before you pitch it, because then you've got consistent pitching rates. And don't be tempted to save it too long, because it will start to deteriorate and die, and that could bring some untoward flavors in there that you don't want. So yeah, it's definitely worth doing. Get advice from your yeast manufacturers. Give Mike and I a shout. More than happy to help to get you going on that. Okay.
Just a quick one. Kevin's just raised a good point as well. When you're using dried yeast, you obviously don't need to oxygenate the work because there's lots of sterols in there already. So you don't need synthesis. When you're repitching yeast, you need to get your oxygen or aeration right. But even
very good point.
Anything down 1040, 1050, air should be fine up to about 8 ppm in the works. You should only need oxygen when you're high gravity brewing anything over 1050.
Just make sure it's sterile filtered air.
Sterile filtered air, yes.
So, but yeah, that's that is a good point. You do need some oxygen in there once you've cropped it, because it's got plenty of sterols there as you pitch it as a dry yeast, but it would need a little bit of support to get it growing in that first 24 hours and get it reproducing. So a little sinter with some sterile compressed air being blown through it will oxygenate the work, no problem. Okay, so moving on to energy then, a few suggestions here. In terms of preheating the tun, bringing that water through, rather than just running it to drain whilst it's heating up, you could actually, if you've got that facility, just take it through the work pump and recirculate back into the tun, back into the top, and just recirculate it around. It'll give up its energy, warm up the tun, you'll ditch that water, and then put your foundation liquor and start brewing. So that does save you money. And I think, Mike, you had some ideas about warming the mains as well.
Yeah, the mains obviously cool down from day to day. But this is one of the mistakes I made at last brewery I put in, actually. We went from a brewery where we was brewing 7 times a day consistently and nothing got cold. And, you know, you never had the issue of any of the pipes cooling down. But obviously, in a smaller brewery where you're brewing once a day, probably pipes that aren't lads, everything cooled down pretty quickly. So the run between the HLT and the mash tun, we had to basically write that water off because it was cold and we couldn't use it. So yeah, basically just a nice little recirc line back to the HLT would have been perfect.
Yep.
And to be fair, a lot of brewers do that.
Yeah, it's not a big expense to put a T-piece in and a valve, and at the end of the day, it would quickly pay yourself back. We talked earlier about hazy beers and about the trend towards unfiltered beers, let's say. So given that, I think there might be an opportunity with certain beer styles or with beers where you're not particularly looking for a very bright beer to reduce to 45 minutes. We won't recommend this for a cask beer, but for other styles, 45 minutes would give you sufficient time to get the bitterness that you're looking for and the flavour development, but it would save you probably 15 or even an hour's worth of energy, depending on what sort of 45 minutes of energy, depending on how long your boil is. So that's something to consider. And it would definitely save quite a bit of money. That's probably the biggest energy cost saving in the brewery, mate.
Yeah, we use more energy when we're boiling than everything else pretty much put together. It's boiling and then it's cooling.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, if you can cut back on it, my thoughts on that one would just be watching DMS levels. Generally, UK malt's pretty low in DMS anyway, but the drive for lighter coloured malts, you do get less kiln in the maltings. You're going to get a bit more DMS in there as well. So just be careful about DMS, but providing it's cooled back as quick as possible, you shouldn't really get any formation. 45 minutes will generally be enough to get rids, providing you don't let it reform.
Yeah.
If you then leave it for 45 minutes in a stand and then you get your work cooling after it, then you're going to get a bit of DMS forming.
Good advice. Okay, this was another one you brought up, mate.
Yeah, so when we say heat exchange service, it's basically anything that's got heat on it. So and not necessarily just from the product side. So it's really good to keep your kettle clean. You know, every couple of brews on an electric element or on coils, you really want to be cleaning it to make sure it's as clean as possible. And then we're going to lose less heat. We're going to be more efficient with what we do and use less. But even things like the heat exchangers, when we're cooling down the worts, we clean the heat exchanger every day on the wort sides, but on the water sides, we're not necessarily cleaning that all the time. And you've got the potential to get scale build up on that as well. So do keep a close eye, have a look at your heat exchangers, maybe open them up every 6 months, just to make sure that they're completely, there's no fouling on the wort side. No matter what, even you've got a big filter in there, you're still going to get resin material building up on the worts. But on the cool side as well, look for any scaling formation and get it cleaned off.
It's a scary thing taking a heat exchanger apart, but I mean, as long as you're careful with your gaskets and you do it gently, then you can get the plates in probably a weak acid solution, Mike, and that would take away any kind of water scale buildup.
Yeah, any acids. There's normally a phosphoric nitric mix that the chemical suppliers use, but the detergent boosters, like the adding the oxy vanish to your wash kind of thing, they're amazing. They're just brilliant. Once I lob one of them in a brew house clean, especially every week.
Yeah,
they're really good.
Fresh it up and clean it up. Another thing Mike mentioned there, like obviously you can get subparticles, you can get bits of hot leaf and all sorts of things on the wort side of the heat exchanger, and they will ultimately start to reduce the effectiveness of that cooling. So occasionally, not every time, but once every I would say month at a minimum, go backwards, so clean backwards through the heat exchanger. It sounds a bit weird, but you'd be surprised how much crap comes out of it. You know, there will be a fair bit of stuff there that you know, wow, how come that didn't clean in the forward direction? But it's just the way these things are designed. They've got quite a convoluted path for the work to follow as they go through to maximize the heat exchange. So by very design, it will catch things if it's always going in the same direction. So going in opposite direction definitely helps.
Yeah.
Okay.
You clean it the same way it basically compresses it on, because the bits that are on there are basically resin.
Mm-hmm.
They stick on. They stick on.
Yeah, it's generally quite a brown resinous substance, isn't it, which is proteins and some of the hot resin materials.
Yeah.
Kind of the opposite of what Mike were talking about earlier about lagged pipes. Coolant pipe work will give up quite a bit of energy. So that then means that your chillers are working harder to get that back down to temperature to do the job of keeping your fermentations in check. So by lagging the coolant pipe work, you will save quite a bit of money, and you'll actually save lots of drips and mess that happens in the brewery, because it's not going to get condensate on it that's going to drop on the floor and cause puddles. So it doesn't have to be expensive stuff. It doesn't have to be all clad in aluminium or anything like that. Just some stuff you can get from the DIY store will do the job, save the mess, and save you some money. Fairly straightforward, that one. This is a bit more complicated, but certainly possible. Balancing the brewing liquor system can save quite a bit of money in terms of when you're cooling back. So you're going to try and recover the energy from the wort and from the kettle back into the hot liquor tank. Having that balance, so you're getting maximum temperature back into the hot liquor tank and it doesn't overflow, means that you're recovering as much energy as possible. And that's going to help kind of balance that enormous cost of boiling the wort. So there's a couple of things you can do there. You can adjust the temperature of the hot liquor. So you can have a hot liquor tank maybe at 85, 87 degrees, and then use a cold liquor spike into the pipe to actually cool it down to the correct strike temperature. Or you can adjust the number of plates on your pack, on your cooling pack, on the heat exchanger, and that will actually give you more efficiency as well. You get more energy out of that liquid and put it back in the hot liquor tank. But it's just a matter of working out the balance so that you've got enough hot liquor to brew and sparge with, but you've not got, and you get as much of that back without overflowing. So that's something to think about and balance out. And it's really just a matter of looking at your system and thinking about the mass balance and the temperature balance, the energy balance. And you can definitely save some money doing that. I've been in many breweries where they're cooling back and there's steam everywhere because you've got the hot liquor tank overflowing because there's not enough room. And that's probably because the temperature of that water coming back were too low, in which case you put more plates on. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. LED lighting, pretty obvious. It's not in every brewery. It's relatively cheap now, and it's a lot less cost than running regular lighting. Cycle times are important. So how many times, done this myself, have you stuck a fermenter onto clean and it's on its caustic cycle, and then you go and you start doing something else, you're filling casks, or you get weighing your malt out for your next brew or your hops, and it ends up circulating around there for like an hour and 20 minutes. You think, oh, I better go turn that off. You can have a really, really clean vessel, but it would have been really, really clean after 20 minutes or half an hour. And that time you spent pumping that round and round has cost you money because that's electricity for the pump. So there's a lot of work you can do in terms of optimizing cycle times, particularly on cleaning, but also on other stuff as well. And by starting to think about these things and measuring them, you can really hone in on pumping costs in particular. So that's what I would say in terms of energy saving for that.
Just on cycle times, it's I look at that through everything through the brewery as well. So it's the cycle time is even the cycle of a brew.
Yes.
Max asks, can you reduce the mashing time as well as can you reduce the mashing time as well once you've done your conversion? So yeah. My point of view on this was it was always easier in the brewery that we worked a couple of years back to reduce the time in the MCV rather than temperature, and it saves time off the day for the same effect. So
yeah, indeed.
I do consider the time quite an easy way of saving some time during the day. If you can shave 20-40 minutes off your mash time, then you've got 25 minutes back.
Indeed. I mean, the key thing is just the reason you kind of 60 minutes is the general norm is that you've got to convert the starches in that mash into sugars. So how you would approach that is you get some iodine solution and then you test the grains to see that they've been converted. And if the iodine grows a bluey black colour, then it's not converted, so you need to leave it. But it would just be a matter of experimenting. Start, let's say, 40 minutes or something, then 45, and just see where that cut-off point is. But it will be brew specific because every brew will have a slightly different grist. And if you've got other cereals in there, then probably be a little bit more cautious, I would say, because those can be a little bit more difficult to convert. You're relying on the multi enzymes to do that conversion for you. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. I'll put leaks on there, mate, as well. So yeah, that's one really that you need to think about. And the best way of doing this I've found is wait till everybody's gone home and it's quiet and nothing's brewing, there's no pumps running, and then just have a walk around in your slippers, nice and quiet, and listen for leaks, listen for air leaks, look for steam leaks, look for liquid leaks as well. You can do that also whilst you're processing a brew because you might have a pump that's leaking. Water leaks, you pay for water coming in, you pay for it going out in some breweries. So all these things, just having one of those, do that once every 6 months, just to go around and make sure that nothing's kind of falling apart, because that can actually save you having a disastrous day where something really breaks and you get a massive leak and you're losing liquid or you're losing time. So it's a good practice, and it will save you money at the end of the day. So thank you, whoever suggested that, Mike. Who suggested that for us?
Yeah. So
yeah, thanks, Ian. Thanks for that. Much appreciated. It was a good one.
Leaks are like pound coins at times, especially.
Oh, indeed. Yeah, really, really adds up. So, okay, so last slide. Let's have a quick run through these.
I'll just go through some of the questions actually that have popped up before we go on.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
So Kevin says batch dry hop addition is better as there is more hop/beer surface area. Doing this several times, we get more contact surface, get more utilization. That makes sense. Make sure you're using the correct energy source for the plants. Yeah, I agree with you on that one, but sometimes you've got to deal the hand you've been given. Electric is expensive but cheaper in capital cost, and then gas burner, and then steam, and I'd also put hot oil in there as well. Alexandro says less boil time equals more hop to add. I think that the reduced boil time is not necessarily cheaper, depends on the brew house, right? I'll let you do your...
Yeah, absolutely right on that one. But keeping in mind that isomerization of the alpha acids does happen pretty quickly at the beginning of the boil. So I've done work on this and taking it right through into final product and done consumer research, and it does work. So there is that potential there, but you're absolutely right. You need to make sure that those hops at the beginning of the boil are in there to deliver the bitterness that you want. And then after that, really, the less time you boil hops, the less isomerization you get. So pretty much the theory goes, I'm not completely convinced about this personally, but the theory goes that if you add late hop, i.e. flame out, that you don't really get any bitterness from that. It's purely aroma. I would suggest 80 degrees, below 80 degrees, you don't get isomerization, but it depends on the plant. But yeah, it's to be approached with caution. I think measuring bitterness on a regular boil brew and then with a reduced boil, being able to measure that bitterness is the best way of understanding.
Yeah,
if you've still
completely plant dependent in my view. In my point of view, I did a lot of this, and we would. A lot of the literature says on T90s you'll get between 35 and 35%, 40% utilization on T90s if you're lucky. We saw 50, if I was honest with you,
right,
on an external work boiler. But I mean that was pumped all the way around as well, which wasn't great. But we saw really good utilization, and we even saw that down at the very late hops that we put in. We would still get 15-20% utilization out of them at that point. So I think it's completely brew house dependent, but ultimately I think you'll get away with it. It's something to check, something to have a look at.
I think so. I mean, another thing I didn't really mention, you just reminded me there, Mike, is that I've got some customers now who actually have the facility to chill back. So they'll go through the heat exchanger back into the kettle till they get to 80 degrees, and then they'll put the late hops in.
Yeah.
And what they've found is they can reduce the amount of aroma hop they put in and still get the aroma in the beer profile that they were looking for.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest advancements that brewers have probably made in the last couple of years, if I'm honest with you. That's kind of like the must-have bit of kit now. Definitely.
And again, it's a bit of pipework modification for a brewery that you've already got, but it really is just a recirculation line back to your kettle. And then, at the end of the day, that's going to save you money. So.
Just safe is all that I'd say on that one. Still got a couple more, Carl. Design the heat exchanger to be able to clean acid every 6 months, but if you can, it's nice. All cleaning flows are counter current to product flow. They should be, not all are. Keep any grills on cooling systems clear of dust leaves. Yes, that's correct as well.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, that is a good one.
Yeah, keep anything that's got a cooling fan on it, keep its intake clear and clean its filters. Good. It's always
great. We get some really good ideas here from everyone else as well. It's brilliant. Thank you. Okay.
Carry on.
Yeah. So chemical costs. First of all, we'll cover that one. So don't be afraid to reduce the amount of chemical you use from recommendations you get from your chemical supplier, because it's pointless using more chemical than you need. So in my experience, 1.5% chlorinated caustic on a cold FV clean is adequate. If you're using a hot clean, you can use regular caustic without the chlorination, and probably reduce that strength even further. And then just make sure it's cycled for the correct amount of time. Similarly with PAA, in most places I've been, people are quite sort of haphazard with that. You only need 0.5%, and in some breweries it's been 0.2% that I've worked in, and it's still effective. It's still a good terminal sterilant at that point. So, Mike, any advice on this?
Yeah, you don't need to use as much PAA as what we all like to use, because we love this stuff. Yeah, caustic, work with your chemical manufacturer for the best one. They're very, very good at advising. But do keep your close eye on it. We swapped to a formulated caustic probably 10 years ago now, where they said we could drop the caustic strength down to 1% for FEs, and it didn't clean a thing. That took some sorting out. So just be careful with it. But yeah, ultimately that comes to optimizing and checking. So get yourself a test kit from them and check what you're putting in, and check for carbonate as well.
Yes.
Obviously, if you've got CO2 within your tanks, and then you put caustic into it, the caustic will absorb the carbonate, and it's pretty much useless. So yeah, get a good test kit and test it.
Yep. End of the day, that's always a good one. Anti-foam, Mike, do you want to cover that one?
Yeah, anti-foam. You can still get silica ones. You can get hop anti-foam as well now. Really good for, again, keeping bitterness within beer. You can lose about 30% of bitterness as the beer's fermenting. So using anti-foam will kind of keep the head down and keep that within, keep the bitterness within the beer. As well, if you do get any foaming issues through the FV, and not only a pain to clean up afterwards, but you're losing beer at the end of the day. So the anti-foam will help control that, and as well, it's going to help you actually make the vessel hold a bit more than what it should. Normally, you might only fill it to 30% maximum capacity. With anti-foam, you might be able to push that to 20, 25%, even down to 15, I suppose. Just allows you to last a little bit more. The good thing about it is as well, every time you stop beer from foaming, you improve its head retention. So although it seems counterproductive to use anti-foam, it does actually help to improve the head as well.
Yep, come down the side of the rest. That's very true. Okay, so CO2, expensive stuff if you are using it, and trying to carbonate in tank, either with a sinter or even your sort of top pressure carbonating, that's more expensive than injecting in line. So Mike, do you want to take us through that one?
Yeah, again, you're getting a better contact area. We put in, as you're injecting in line, the CO2 is hitting all parts of the beer. If you're doing it via inline sinter, then especially if it's in the side, you've got a lot of the tank, everything below it, and a lot of it to the side where the CO2 doesn't actually go through. So inline lets you use a lot less CO2. Obviously, as you fill in, it could foam, which is not what you want to do. So you kind of probably do over 80% of the run. So it depends how big your run is. If it was a 100-barrel run just for ease, I know no one's going to have that. Then you fill the first 10 barrels of the tank flat, and then you'd start putting the CO2 in afterwards, and then the CO2 is going to build, but it's not going to foam because it's going into other beers.
Yeah, I think just having a good top pressure on it as well, Mike.
Exactly.
Sure, get holding it in.
Top pressure on needs.
As low a temperature as possible.
Yeah. And CO2 is all about partial pressures and whatnot. So if you put it in line, it's good to have something in there to help it mix. So some 90-degree bends are good for it, but really, really bad for cleaning.
Static mixers are good out there. Really good.
Or before some kind of Ventura is really good. Or before a heat exchanger. Again,
Yeah.
heat exchangers are very good for mixing. So yeah, considering how much people are canning these days and kegging, CO2 is pretty expensive, and every 5 years we always seem to get a little bit of a
Shortage.
Supply problem as prices get pushed up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. Good, thanks, Mike. This is an interesting one that I've come across. In terms of Her Majesty's Customs and Excise, so this is kind of UK guys. I don't know for you international guys whether you get involved with this, but essentially here we're talking about cask beer. So cask beer has a sediment in it that naturally settles out before it's served, and that sediment isn't saleable. So what the tax people say is that if it's not saleable, we won't tax it. So as a kind of general figure, in my experience, a couple of litres out of a firkin being 41.1 litres, I think, a couple of litres of that is unsaleable. So when you're paying your duty bill, you only need to be paying 39 litres of beer in each firkin. That's going to save you some money if you're currently paying on a full container. All you need to do is make sure that you can prove that you've got that 2 litres of unsaleable sediment in there. So if you're racking anything up in the brewery for tasting or for decanting off to put into polypins or mini kegs, just measure the amount of non-saleable yeast and crap that you've got in the cask afterwards and record it somewhere. And then if you get an inspector come along, you can show them that and prove that you've only got 39 litres of saleable beer in there. Okay, so that could be quite a bit of saving if you're not doing it. And if you are, all good on to you. Okay, Mike, do you want to talk us through flow meters?
Yeah, so the flow meters have come a long way these days. They used to be where the cheap ones were over the vein ones that you don't particularly want to use because they're not very hygienic, and the mad flow things from Anderson House cost a small fortune. But you can get some really cool ones now where the battery powered and just mounted on a little unit. SS3 sell them, and so do Brewology, and so does quite a few people. And I think they're about £1,000 to £1,500, but really, really worth it. So hygienic. I think they work off MagFlow, but just really good way of measuring exactly what you've got and allowing you to. If you can't measure it, you can't do anything about it. So being able to have that little flow meter and just seeing exactly what's going on through the different processes as you go through allows you to pinpoint exactly what's going on and help you get into some of the losses.
Okay, and just as a final point, a guideline, if you like, the optimum ratio of water to beer in a craft brewery, from things I've read in my own experience, should be about 4:1. So for every barrel of beer produced, you should use no more than 4 barrels of water to get there. Right, so that includes everything, but that's a good ratio. And if you can work on that, depending on where and how you pay your water bills, you might be paying for water coming in, and then you might be paying for effluent going out. So that's a really big saving. You've just got one bill that actually incorporates the effluent side of it, and there's still a saving to be had. But it's surprising what you can do in terms of saving water. And if you want some advice, give me or Mike a shout.
Yeah. So 3:1, I think, is seen as industry standard, isn't it? Or it was
world class. Yeah,
that was world class. But I mean, Heineken and AB InBev now are driving this down below 2, aren't they?
Hey, it wouldn't surprise me. I know they were about 2.5 when I left ABI. So
yeah, I know they're definitely 2. So yeah. There's a long way to go on that. People are putting a lot of money into it. Right, we've got a few more comments / questions. Kevin, it'd be interesting if you just put a bit more information on this one. Evidence produced by the FAA in the US stating PAA is shown to be toxic at less than 0.4%. Is that for everything, including yeasts, if you don't mind? I know it is for lowers, but yeast, the PAA is pretty poor at killing yeast at times. Another one, all vessels are base filled, correct, apart from the mash tun. Minimize fobbing, loses head and leads to invisible haze from denatured bubbles. This then reduces both volume and shelf life of product due to haze forming over time. It's quite interesting as well with fobbing. It was probably 15 years ago. We was producing a major UK beer in a continental beer in green bottles, and we were following protocol where we didn't clean the tank after emptying it. So I think we were allowed to fill it 3 times before we emptied it, but we're getting quite a bit of fobbing while we was doing it, and then the foam build-up passed through into subsequent batches, and started actually seeing collapsed fog within the bottle as a particle.
It's in that snowflakes.
Yeah. RE cash due to need to keep records for each brand at least once per annum. And Mark also says, just make sure you have a note on the label with the bottom's allowance on the cask. That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, indeed.
Because I've just been rereading about label stuff, which was always interesting. So, is that pretty much it now, Cal?
It is indeed. Yeah, hope that's been useful.
So me and Carl's that's the end of the presentation now. Me and Carl are going to stick around for a little bit, and we're happy to have more of a chat with anyone. Either do it via the chat bot, so we can try and let you speak if I can figure out the technology. But thanks for watching.